This FedGov Today program is sponsored by EY. On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, when you add AI to your workflow, don't get too far ahead of yourself.
We are so eager to implement these things and see the results. We are not thinking about day two.
George Kaczmarski of EY on FedGov Today in just a moment. First, though, on FedGov Today TV this week, how and when you can move money around during the shutdown. Former IRS Commissioner and former OMB Controller Danny Werfel will tell you what's cool and what's not. And former DHS Chief Procurement Officer Soraya Correa explains the most important things to tell your team during and after the shutdown. You can watch the show on the FedGov Today YouTube channel anytime, and it's available on our website at fedgovtoday.com. The Federal Robotic Process Automation Community of Practice says it finds more than 2,700 use cases of RPA across the federal government now. The COP says it expects that number to grow this year, too. George Kaczmarski is principal for the government and public sector at EY. He was on FedGov Today TV recently to describe how agencies can automate more and better. George, thanks for joining me again. It's great to have you back on the program. You said a couple of things when you were on TV with me a couple of weeks ago that I wanted to ask you more about. One, and we got into this a little bit on TV, is don't automate a mess. And I asked you on TV, I guess the reason you have to say that is because you've seen people try to do it. What have you seen the best practices for examining a business process and changing a business process before one then goes about the process of automating that, so you avoid that automating a mess? Welcome, George.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Great to see you again. It's for sure we have seen this. This journey of automation has been going on just under a decade in earnest. And the really interesting thing is, I think in the beginning there was this general unbridled enthusiasm that we have these, disruptive automation technologies that we can run into a burning building and start automating everything. And what we tended to do is we were looking for processes to automate, and we would automate them as is without really taking a step back and asking ourselves, are we automating the right thing? Is the process, does it exist for the right reasons? Is it still valid after, a decade since we've initially created it? And so what we saw instead was, when people really started maturing into their automation journey, they took a big step back and they reevaluated the process. They asked themselves, why does this exist? Is it the most optimal set of steps? Are the policies we've put in place appropriate for the process? And what we ended up doing, the big change is, if I took more of a tool-led approach, meaning I have an automation tool and I'm going to go screw it in, versus a process-led approach. In a tool-led approach, I automated exactly what was there before. In a process-led approach, I would eliminate steps. I would deflect activity if it wasn't needed. And I would only automate those pieces that made the most sense. And I would leave the human in the loop, if you will, for the areas where, in the moments that matter for a particular experience, for example.
So
that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because, and one success story in that area that I'm aware of, and not that it's the only one, there are tons of them, but the one that comes to mind right away is the State Department changing their passport renewal process, automating that. And they eliminated steps, and by doing exactly what you suggested. They said, do we still need to do this, or is there a tool that will do that, or do we just not need that step anymore? And it made me recall a conversation with a federal CIO from 4 or 5 years ago, it's been now, I guess, where this person said, we may start with 5 steps and we may discover that the best business process is 11 steps, but they're not the same. We're not just adding 6 steps. We're doing it in a different way to achieve a better outcome, and we can then wind up doing it better, faster, cheaper, whatever the desired outcome is. And that's gets at, I think, what you're describing, which is really understanding what's the point and what are the most logical steps to get to that point, regardless of how we're doing it now. Am I on the right track there?
You are. The thing I would add to that, Francis, is, there's probably a good example out of banking. Several years ago, one of our clients was working on an automation in the disputes process in credit cards. So, if you get your credit card statement and you see something on there you don't agree with, you pick up the phone, you call the bank and you go, hey, I'd like to dispute this charge. Well, in that scenario, what happens in the background is, the call center agent will go through, log the claim, and then someone goes in the background, researches it with the merchant and comes back. That costs the bank a lot of money in terms of time, right? In this case, let's say it costs $28. So what the bank would do is if that charge was less than $28, they wouldn't bother researching it, right? They would just auto adjudicate it and pay it out. When we worked with a bank and we took a look at the process end to end, instead of just automating that $28, we actually asked ourselves where are the costs coming from and streamlined that process. And we're able to reduce that down to, let's say, I'm making up numbers right now, $15, right? And by changing the policy and changing the process, we were able to, in thousands of claims every day, we're able to, deliver real savings to the bottom line that way. But we wouldn't have done it if we just say, hey, let's just automate the process without reevaluating why we were, creating so much cost in the first place.
All right. So it seems to me then, I understand the best practices that you've described now. You talked about them on TV, about an individual business case, an individual process. Yeah. Is there then the next level, it seems to me, is how do you automate the automation process? How do you scale it? How do you accelerate it so that you're not, reinventing every single thing every single time? That seems to me to be the next logical step.
Yeah, the question is how do we embed automation into the fabric of our organization, right? And how do we do it at scale? How do we do it accelerated? How do we do it in a sustainable and operationally resilient way? And I would say there are probably 4 or 5 key things that we have to get right if we want to do automation at scale in an organization. One is this process first mindset, which we talked about. So we won't drain that again, but that's paramount because that takes us from incrementally tweaking our business to leapfrog transformation events in the organization. But the other thing is, probably even before we do that, is the process by which we identify the automation opportunities and creating that at scale. And there are ways, lots of different techniques to do that, but there are probably 3 things to consider. One is we need to define what automation means in an organization. And I think we talked about this before, about opening up the aperture of the automation techniques available to us. Once we start looking at it and saying, hey, I've got 25 different automation techniques available to myself, that means my art of the possible of which processes I can automate vastly changes. So that's one. But the other part of that is, you can take a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. Bottom-up approach is we go out to the organization, we canvass everyone, say, hey, throw me your automation ideas. And I put them in a big funnel or a big pipeline, and then I start working it, or try to prioritize it. The other way is to go top-down, right? And say, look, the mission of our organization is XYZ. The strategy, what we're trying to change is, ABC. And now let's identify all the processes and functions in an organization that fit that strategy. And it's not an either or between bottom up and top down. It is a question of where the priority of the agency or the organization is. If in like today's world, the aim is we've got to create efficiency and cost takeout in an organization, we're going to come top down on that, right? If we are trying to reduce pain and increase retention in an organization, we may canvass our employees and ask them to come up with ideas that keep them from being happy at their jobs, right? In a bottom-up approach. So how I identify like the pipeline of automation opportunities really is another key lever, and having that right methodology and that structure in place is important.
It strikes me that there's just a ton of evaluation going here. And in a situation like a federal agency where you've got budget pressures, you've got a situation where you don't know what you're going to be doing next week, the week after that, because of funding situations and so on, deciding which of those, top down or bottom up, you may not have the luxury of that. You may have this whole long list of things that should have ideally been done yesterday, and sorting through all of that, triaging that sounds like maybe the biggest challenge.
It actually is. And so we came across this in commercial too, right? The easiest way to do this is to quantify every opportunity and say, here's the dollar impact of every one, right? But let's challenge that for a second, because if I go into a commercial enterprise, right, I can measure the impact of automation by how much efficiency or cost savings is. But I could also maybe measure, did I increase customer satisfaction, right? Or brand, reputation, or did I reduce risk or increase compliance, or, improved employee satisfaction like we talked about, or created revenue opportunities, or like I said in the example earlier, the credit card company is, avoid additional costs, right? So there are all these different value drivers that I can evaluate. And the question is, how do I normalize those different value drivers in a business case?
Yeah.
And so if I've got a bottom up or a top down, it doesn't matter. I've got to be able to prioritize them in some method. And that's where I was saying, you've got every mission and every, organization is going to have a different set of priorities. But you're right, that is no easy task. But if I want to do this at scale, I've got to come up with a rubric to arbitrate the decision between hundreds of automation opportunities.
Okay. And so then the first thing I think somebody would say is, well, looking at the dollar impact doesn't matter in a federal agency because we're not a for-profit organization. But if you change that dollar impact to mission delivery impact, the other factors, it strikes me, that you just described still apply, because maybe customer experience is not exactly the same, but maybe trust and is as important as, say, brand awareness or something like that. And certainly risk reduction is something that everybody in a federal agency, at least in leadership, is thinking about.
Of course. And look, even in our government, there are going to be, civil agencies that have different measures than defense agencies, which, if I go into the supply chain of defense, readiness is a key factor I need to worry about. It may not be as much, cost savings, right?
All right. So you mentioned a couple of levers for accelerating automation. Are there others?
Yeah, there are two others I would want to highlight. One, and I think we talked about this, but there's this concept of solution architecture. Okay, so we're talking about, how do I scale automation in accelerating an organization? Right now, as we start saying, look, we have thousands of automation opportunities, and I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of systems I need to integrate with, and processes, and yada yada yada. The question becomes, well, how do I best automate, right? George, you just told me there are probably 15 to 20 different automation tools, right? There are all these processes, and we bring it down to one automation opportunity, and we go, okay, let's automate it. And then I'm going to ask the question, well, how is the best way to do that from a technology perspective? Do I pick, RPA, robotic process automation? Do I write a script? Do I custom develop some Python code? Do I change the feature functionality in one of our ERP systems? Right? What's the best way to do this? I might even not have to do any of that. It might be a data problem in the first place, and I need to go fix that back at the source. So those questions I just asked have to be able to be resolved in a methodical process. And the way to do that is to implement a solution architecture function inside of an organization that is focused solely on automation. And the challenge with that is, as we've seen in the industry, is you can't find one person that's a solution architect. There's not a unicorn out there that understands all these different technologies. In fact, it tends to be a toll gate in your development process, where you have a architectural, committee, board, whatever you want to do. I've got a great enterprise architect. I have an automation architect. I have a data architect, whatever. And I put them in a room. I lock the door and say, you can't come out until you guys agree on which technology you're going to use, right? But we've seen that become an issue as we try to scale, because what ends up happening is you get someone who's familiar with the process. They've got a technology person they know, and they come up with a solution that is really the path of least resistance, instead of being the most appropriate one that's going to reduce long-term technical debt, et cetera. And so this idea, much like we talked about, including a rubric of decisioning for prioritizing process opportunities, we need the same for the technology side, which is what's my rubric, what's my decision matrix for when I pick which technology to be best. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Final thought is what unintended consequences should people be thinking about as they're walking through this process, George?
That's a great question. Here's probably the biggest one. We are so genuinely excited about all this technology that's in front of us and the impact, right? The latest conversation is around, agentic AI, generative AI or whatever. The unintended consequence is we are so eager to implement these things and see the results. We are not thinking about day two, right? Day one, I put it in place and it runs, it's great, but I'm not thinking about day two. I can't set and forget it. There is an operational, nurturing and maintenance of all these implementations we put together that we have to be thinking about. And one would argue, if I want to do that right, I should be doing it back when I'm redesigning my process and not after the fact.
All right. And just a quick follow on to that, you told me on TV, year 5 is the most difficult stage for agencies to envision. So it's not even just the second day, but it sounds like what you're getting at is the long-term ramifications of what somebody does when they automate something. It doesn't always get the attention it deserves.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to, the other lever we didn't talk about is this concept of governance, right? The governance is just a set of processes in of itself. But why I said 5 years is so difficult is because we a lot of times don't have the organizational fortitude to institutionalize these governance processes that are paramount to take care of all these automations we've created. So think of it this way. If I had 1,000 people doing, 1,000 jobs, today, and I've automated 50% of that, and those people are now doing something more productive, right? Someone's still got to take care of that work being performed 5 years from now, right? Someone's got to be overseeing it. We can't ignore or abdicate our responsibilities for overseeing those processes. And so the operating model, the governance, all the funding and budget management for these automations we created tends to hit a crescendo about 3 to 5 years out when you have one of those moments like, oh my gosh, like who's taking care of all of this? So that's where that comes from.
It's always great to talk to you, George. Thanks for joining me today.
Real pleasure, Francis. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.
You can read more about automating your agency's workflows on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The FedGov Today podcast is back tomorrow. If you don't want to miss that, you can follow the FedGov Today podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on the FedGov Today YouTube channel, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.